Here in Figma, first we need to create a frame. So I'm going to hit A on my keyboard. And from these pre-built frames, I'm going to select desktop because when it comes to creating a grid system, basically we need to have 3 different frames. One for desktop, one for tablet, and one for mobile, right? Right now let's create the other frames we need. I'm going to hit A on my keyboard. Now we need one tablet as well. For the tablet, I'm going to go with iPad mini, this one, just like this. And we need one for mobile as well. So I'm going to go to phone and I'm going to pick iPhone 14, just like that. So we have our 3 different frames. Now we need to start creating our grid. Well, basically we need to have 2 types of grids. We need to have a horizontal grid and also a vertical grid. But why? Because we want to keep our spacing consistent both horizontally and vertically. I'm going to start with the desktop version. I'm going to select this frame. And if I head over to the layout grid section in the design inspector and hit this plus button, as you can see, a grid has been added to this frame. I'm going to change the type of this grid to column. All right. I'm going to click on this layout grid settings, and from this drop down menu, I can change it to columns. Because for web design, we always use a column grid for our horizontal alignment. All right. For the desktop, we need to set the count to 12. Always use 12 columns for the desktop frame. And here we can specify the type. Some designers prefer to set it to center for the desktop version and set the type to stretch for iPad and mobile. However, to make this grid responsive, we need to set it to stretch. So I'm going to set the type to stretch. And when you set it to stretch, you can only adjust the margin and gutter. All right. If you don't know what these are, the gutter amount is basically the space between your columns. And the margin is the space around these columns. So right now, by default, it's set to 0. But if I increase it to, let's say, 50, you can see that we have some empty space on the sides of this frame. All right, for the desktop grid, I usually set the gutter to 32 because we have more space to work with. All right. But what about the margin? How do I know which amount is suitable for this margin property? Well, when it comes to margin, it all depends on your container size. But what's a container? Well, basically a container is an area that holds your content organized and neatly towards the center of your frame, okay? So if you take a look at this design, for instance, if I select any of these sections, for example, this search card, you can see that inside we have a container. And the width of this container is 1120 points. All right, here as well, if I open up this services section, you can see we have another container, the same width. And the same thing applies to the testimonials section and all other sections below. So that's how we can make sure that we have consistency across our project. But you may ask, how should I specify the container size? Well, that's a good question because there is no standard. But there are some recommendations. Some designers prefer to use 1140 points for the desktop container. Some designers like me prefer 1120 points. Some designers prefer 1100 points. That's totally fine. It all depends on the type of project you work on and how narrow you want your content to be. So if you want to have more margins on the sides of your content, you need to go with a smaller container. I personally use 1120 points as my container size for desktop. And for tablet, I use 680 points. And for mobile, 358. Some designers prefer 360 points. That's fine. All right, so let's get back to our grid system here. Now that you know what a container is and what's the point of using a container, I'm going to go ahead and set the margin here to 160. Why? Because I want my container's width to be 1120 points, okay? So if I go ahead and create a rectangle here, just like this, you will see that I'll get 1120. So that's basically our horizontal grid. But what about our vertical grid? To create a vertical grid, you can simply select this frame, again head over to the layout grid section, hit this plus button once again, and this time I'm going to change the type of this grid from grid to rows. So as you can see now we have vertical rows. This time I'm going to set the type to top because I want this grid to start from the top of my screen. And then I want to set the count to something huge, like 1000. The reason I set it to 1000 is because when you go ahead and increase the height of this frame, you will still get this vertical grid. But what about these values? For the offset, just set it to 0 because we don't want to have any offset from the top and bottom sides. For the height, I prefer to use 8, especially if you want to use an 8-point or 4-point grid system. And for the gutter, I can set it to 8 as well. Alright? So now, when you go ahead and create an element, let me show you what happens. Let's suppose you create this rectangle, and when you try to move it just like this, as you can see, it snaps to the nearest row or column. And when you modify its dimension, it again snaps to the nearest row or column. So that's how you can make sure that your numbers are always going to be divisible by 8. Alright, but what about the tablet version? For tablet, we usually use 8 columns. Why? Because we don't have so much space to work with. Alright? As the size of our frame decreases, the number of columns should decrease as well. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to select this desktop frame, and I can either go ahead and create a layout grid style, alright? Or I can just select these grids, just hover over this area, click once to select this particular layout grid, hold down the Shift key, click once again here to select this layout grid, and copy them. Hit Ctrl C or Command C. Select this iPad frame, hit Ctrl V or Command V, and there we go. We have our vertical and horizontal grids, but we need to make some adjustments. As for the vertical grid, we don't need to change it for any of these frames because our vertical grid should always have the same properties and preferences, regardless of our screen size. But what about our horizontal grid? I'm going to click on this icon here, and I'm going to set the count to 8. And also, since we don't have that much space on a tablet screen, I'm going to decrease this margin and this gutter here. I'm going to decrease this margin to 32, just like this, and the gutter to 16. So using this grid, we can use the whole available width of the screen, since we don't have so much margin here. That's why I set the margin to a lower value than what we had here for desktop. On desktop, we had so much room. However, that's not the case with iPad. But what about iPhone? I'm going to select these two once again, copy them and paste them here. For mobile, we are going to decrease the column count to 4. And also, I'm going to set the margin to 16 and gutter should be 16 as well. But why 16 here? Because it's recommended not to go below 16 points. Some designers go to 24 or 32. That's fine, but I highly recommend not to go below 16 points to just have some safe area around your content. I'm not sure if you've noticed or not, but all the values I used for all these grids are divisible by 8. Alright, here I have 32, 16. Here I have 16, 16, and here for desktop, I have 160 and 32. Because I know that I'm going to use an 8-point or a 4-point grid system. And the good thing about these grids is that they are responsive since we set the type to stretch. If you set it to center, it's not going to be responsive, okay? But here, since we set it to stretch, they are responsive, just like this. And that's exactly what we needed. Alright, now let me give you some tips on how to use these grids properly in your projects. So, as I mentioned before, when you just create any shape here, it could be a rectangle or anything, it could be a text layer, it automatically snaps to these rows and columns, alright? But when you use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move your elements around, you can move it down by either 1 pixel, just like this, or if you hold down the Shift key, you can move it down by 10 pixels, just like that, or move it up. And that would be problematic when you use an 8-point grid system. To fix this issue, you can simply head over to the Figma preferences here, and from this quick actions, you can look for nudge amount. Alright, if you just look for nudge amount and open it up, here this window allows you to specify your small nudge amount and your big nudge amount. If you just decrease it to 8 from 10 and you go ahead and try to move your elements down or up using the arrow keys and Shift key, as you can see now it's moving by 8 pixels. There's one more thing I'd like to point out here, and I think that's a question of many junior designers. Well, when you start designing and when you start learning about grid systems, you think that everything should be aligned with your layout grid, okay? And that's wrong. Let me prove that to you. I'm gonna just unhide my layout grid. Right at the top, we have this navigation bar, right? And inside this navigation bar, we have a container. But look what we have inside. None of these links are aligned with our columns, and they shouldn't be. Why? Because when it comes to using a grid, we just want to make sure that our container is aligned with these columns. And if I zoom in, you can see that my container is perfectly aligned with this first column. And also here, my buttons are perfectly aligned with this last column. The same thing applies to all other sections. For example, here we have this search card. And as you can see, this whole container is aligned with my layout grid, but whatever is placed inside is not aligned with these columns because it's impossible to align everything with these columns. So when you want to align elements inside other elements, you need to make sure to have consistent padding. That's all. So here, if you take a look at the padding inside, we have a 40-point vertical padding and an 80-point horizontal padding. Right? The same thing applies to these cards. As you can see, each card is aligned with the layout grid here, but the elements inside are not aligned with the layout grid. However, we have consistent padding inside. If I select this element, you can see that the left padding is set to 32. If I select this frame, you can see that the bottom and right padding are set to 30 points as well. And also keep in mind that a layout grid is nothing but a guide, all right? Sometimes we need to break the rule. For example, here, as you can see, this picture, this image here, is not aligned with my layout grid perfectly. As you can see, it's outside my grid, and that's fine because I intentionally put it like